This video is going to explain to you the definition of parables, the 5 parts of a parable, and how to dissect parables and find the radical concept. If you look under the Luke module on Canvas, you will find incomplete notes for this PowerPoint. Make sure that you have those so that when you go through this, you can fill in the blanks as you go, and it should help this make more sense. So first of all, a little review and definition. Recall from our study of the Hebrew Scriptures, there are various types of literary genres found in the Bible. So parable is just one example of those many types of genres. And to remind you of the definition, these are fictional stories told to bring out a radical concept. Now, radical concept is a new term that we're introducing here, but basically parables are made-up stories that are to tell a message. And many times these stories are told in response to a question. So if you've ever found it frustrating in class when you ask me a question and I respond with a question, Jesus was even better, because when you ask him a question, often he would respond with a story. And then you had to figure out the answer to the question by dissecting the meaning of the story. So parables in general were built upon the daily experiences of the time period, which is why often we struggle to understand them, because the daily experiences of our time period are very different. So they're going to talk about farming and agriculture, shepherding, things that we're not as familiar with. If we were to talk about parables today, they'd be more about Facebook and Twitter and iPhones. They can also be a simile or comparison, taking two very different things and then comparing them, like the kingdom of heaven. These are often very exaggerated for the purpose of getting people's attention and trying to prove a point. And these stories are the method by which Jesus introduces his teaching to the people. Remember, Jesus, like the prophets, is very enigmatic. Parables don't necessarily have a single meaning, but layers of interpretation. So even though we're trying to find the radical concepts here, this isn't like math. It's not like once we figure out 2 + 2 is 4, we're done. There can be multiple layers of interpretation. However, that doesn't mean that any interpretation we want can fit any parable. We can discern the dominant interpretation based on evidence from the text. So you also always need to be going back to the text in order to explain where your interpretation is coming from. There are 5 parts to the parable: the hook, the prevalent thought, the surprise twist, the radical concept, and the doable action. The parable starts with a hook. That's the attention getter. If you don't have the audience's attention, the rest of your parable doesn't matter because they're not listening. Then, the stories were based on a prevalent thought. This is an idea that most people in Jesus' time thought to be true. It's usually an idea the Jewish people used to answer Jesus' questions. Now, this is usually not stated, but rather implied, because it's the dominant outlook of the time. So the prevalent thought is going to be difficult for you to figure out because it's not going to tell you what it is in the text. However, one way that you can find the prevalent thought is by reading your footnotes and by using your knowledge of the Old Testament that we've spent so much time studying, learning, and understanding, and your understanding of Jewish culture, to try and figure out what these prevalent thoughts are. When these questions are asked of Jesus, or the topics that are coming up to Jesus, people think they know what the answers are. Those thoughts are the prevalent thought. However, Jesus usually has a very different idea. And that different idea is revealed with the surprise twist. And that is the surprise turn in the plot or the story as Jesus told it. So the audience is expecting one thing, and then bam, Jesus hits them with another. But not literally, because Jesus was not violent. So the surprise twist is when things don't happen as expected. And the surprise twist then reveals the radical concept. Now, the radical concept is the whole purpose of the story. It's the brand new idea or the answer to the question that Jesus wanted to teach. The whole point of the story is to reveal the radical concept. Remember, the story's made up. It's a fictional story. It's being used to introduce this radical concept. The idea is considered radical because it's new. Also because it's different from what the Jewish people believed at that time. And it showed deeper insight into the question or issue raised before the parable began. These stories usually contradict the prevalent thought or traditional way of Jewish thinking. That's why they're being seen as radical. And the entire parable story uses the comparison or the simile to reveal this radical concept to the people. All parable stories also have a doable action. This is something we can do to live out the message. To reveal this to yourself, ask, what does the parable call us to do? What is the practical application for us as disciples? And the doable action is usually related to the radical concept. Notice the radical concept is a concept. It's a thought, a worldview, a way of looking at things, whereas the doable action is then putting that concept into action. So let's use an example. The example we're going to use today is the Good Samaritan. So I've broken this story up into pieces to show you the 5 parts of the parable. So, to start, and a lawyer stood up and put him, Jesus, to the test, saying, "Teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus said to him, "What is written in the law? How does it read to you?" And he answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And he, Jesus, said to him, "You have answered correctly. Do this and you will live." But wishing to justify himself, he said to Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" This is the question. So this entire parable is Jesus' way of answering this question. And the answer to the question, who is my neighbor, is going to be the radical concept. So, the story begins, and Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell among robbers, and they stripped him and beat him and went away, leaving him half dead." This is the hook. All right, the very first sentence of the story is an action sentence. A man is walking around and all of a sudden he gets robbed, stripped, beat, and left half dead. And as awful as that sounds, everybody is instantly interested because they want to know what's going to happen to this guy. There's been violence, there's been action. Now we know everyone's interested. And by chance, a priest was going down that road. Now, prevalent thought, not stated in the text. A priest. Prevalent thought at the time, priests are good people. They will help. So the prevalent thought here is, the priest is going to help this poor man. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Surprise twist! The priest did not do what we expected in the prevalent thought. Next sentence. Likewise, a Levite also, when he came to the place. Okay, another prevalent thought, Levites. We also are going to assume Levites, good people, gonna do the right thing and help out. And when he saw him, he passed by on the other side. Surprise twist again, doesn't do the prevalent thought that we expected here. But a Samaritan who was on the journey came upon him. Prevalent thought here, we know from our study of the Old Testament, Samaritans were looked down upon. So our assumption here, Samaritans, they're bad, they're different, they're the enemy, they're no good. So surely, nothing good will come from this encounter. And when he saw him, he felt compassion and came to him and bandaged up his wounds, pouring oil and wine on them, put him on his own beast and brought him to an inn and took care of him. On the next day, he took out 2 denarii, denarii being equivalent to a day's wages, so 2 days' wages, and gave them to the innkeeper and said, "Take care of him, and whatever more you spend, when I return, I will repay you." Surprise twist. The person we thought would not do anything about the situation is in fact the person who shows compassion and acts. and acts in a very exceedingly compassionate way. Which of these three do you think proved to be a neighbor to the man who fell into the robber's hands? It's Jesus saying that. And he said, the one who showed mercy toward him. Here is our radical concept. So the people hearing the story think, wow, the Samaritan, the one we judged as quote unquote wrong, bad, the enemy, different, was the neighbor because he's the one that showed mercy. And so if the person who we feel is the most uncomfortable around, the person that society has trained us to think are wrong, bad, the enemy, different, all of these in quotes, of course. So that means if the question is, who is my neighbor? And Jesus is demonstrating the group you feel most uncomfortable around is the best here, that means everyone is our neighbor, right? Even the ones we feel most uncomfortable around. And if that's the case, then everyone should be treated with love and mercy. So that's your radical concept in bold there. Then Jesus said to him, go and do the same. That's our doable action. Treat everyone as your neighbor and treat everyone with love and mercy. So, homework-wise, I've already asked you to read the parable stories in Luke and in Matthew and summarize them. Now I want you to look for the radical concept of each of these stories to complete the parables example homework found under your Luke module for Tuesday. Now this is a really challenging assignment. Obviously I chose a parable that breaks down really, really well to be the example one. So let me give you some suggestions. The way to find the radical concept is to ask yourself some questions like, what is Jesus trying to teach us in this story? Or how is Jesus answering the question he's been asked? Keep in mind the question is not always stated, but it could be, the idea that they're talking about. Or ask yourself, why would Jesus tell this story? Or what is the moral of this story? Why is this story here? Or remember that the doable action is usually the radical concept put into practice. So if it's easier for you to figure out what should we do as a result of this parable, figure out what you should do and then take the action and put it into a statement, and that's the radical concept. The big thing here is to remember neither the radical concept nor the doable action are always clearly stated in the text. Jesus doesn't make this easy for us. We have to think about it. And we'll talk more on Tuesday about why this is so hard. But just keep in mind here that you're going to have to do some thinking, some digging here. It's not going to be gift wrapped or as easy as the example story was. But the main thing here is make sure that when you read each story, you complete a good summary and then do your very best at trying to find just the radical concept. You don't need to worry about the other parts of the parable. We're just honing in on the radical concept. Also, remember that we have our field trip on Monday. On the calendar, you'll note there that I've also reminded you about a couple of things there for that field trip. And also maybe keep in mind why or how that field trip might connect to this story and to the concept of who is my neighbor. Thank you very much. Hope you have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.